Welcome to Woodland Cemetery. Opened in 1879, much of the history of the city of London is written here in the stones that you see on the ground. And one of the strongest parts of that history is the story of World War I, in which many Londoners fought and died and are buried overseas. We are going to take you on a walking tour and show you some of the names and the places and the dates in which Londoners fought and died in the First World War, and they are memorialized by their families here at Woodland Cemetery. This is the memorial to Private John Harold Isaac, Canadian Medical Corps. Prior to his enlisting, Private Isaac was already going through some family problems. His wife, Edith, was very sick, and as it turns out, she had heart disease, and she passed away in 1915 at the age of 22. They had no children. Reeling from the events of her death and the loss of his wife, Private Isaac, well then he was just John Harold Isaac, elected to join the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and he shipped overseas. But when he arrived at England, it seemed that he also had his own medical problems, as he went through a series of infections that plagued him throughout his time in the service. He did manage to serve completely until 1918 and the end of the war, but at that time, he was also diagnosed with leukemia. And the result was that he was too sick to go home to Canada, and he remained in England until the time of his death, which was on April 22nd, 1919. And he is buried in Basingstoke Cemetery in England, and he was only 28 years old at that time. This is one of the Kingsmill family monuments here at Woodland Cemetery. And this monument here is the War Graves Monument of Captain Henry A. Kingsmill, who was a member of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. And he is one of the few soldiers on the Woodland tour that is actually buried here at Woodland Cemetery. As a boy, he worked at the Kingsmill store on Dundas Street. He was also a member of the 1st Hussars later on in life. And he graduated from the University of Western Ontario, now known as Western University, as a doctor, in which he was licensed to be a physician. Now, during the First World War, there was huge pressure placed on doctors in Canada, and approximately half the doctors in Canada served at the front during the First World War. He was an older man at the time, approximately 49 years old when he enlisted, and he was sorely needed in England. So the result was that he enlisted late in April of 1918. So that was only about 7 months before the end of the war. And he served there until the war, until armistice, and then he returned home. And something was happening in Europe at the time that was affecting the entire world, and that was the breakout of the Spanish flu epidemic. And it was somewhere there during that time that he was practicing at a physician here at home, that he contracted the Spanish flu, and he died fairly quickly, in less than a week. And his date of death is stated as February 11th, 1920, and he was only 52 years old. This is the stone of the family lot for the Davis family here at Woodland Cemetery. And on the ground in front of me is a memorial marker to their son, Lewington George Davis, who is known as one of the boy soldiers of the British Army. It's a little known fact, but approximately 250,000 underage soldiers served in the British Army during the First World War. And he was one of them. When the war broke out, like many boys, he was excited, so he tried to enlist. And that's in 1915. It took him about 5 months to realize that he wasn't 18 years old, where in reality he was 16 years and 5 months. So they tried to send him home. They kick him out. He goes back to England. He turns around and enlists again, telling him again that he is 18 years old. So he thinks he's very lucky, and he manages to stay in the army long enough that they don't know about his being underage, and they ship him out to France. But unlucky for him is he's shipped out to France, and he ends up being involved in the Battle of the Somme, which starts on July 1st, 1916. On the first day of the battle, there was 500 boy soldiers killed and approximately 2,000 wounded. By the end of the battle, there was over 18,000 boy soldiers killed and wounded. He was one of them again. It's late in the battle. It's actually approximately November 18th, 1916. And he's shot in the leg and it breaks his leg. It's not considered to be a bad wound, and so they evacuate him back over to England, where he's in a hospital in Cardiff. Unlucky for him, while he's in the hospital, he contracts gas gangrene in the wound, and the result was it travels through his body, and he dies on December 11th, 1916, and he was 17 years old. His stone in England says that he was 17, and his stone here memorializing him also at Woodland Cemetery says that he was 17 years old. This is the Carr family lot at Woodland Cemetery, and this plaque down here is in memory of a member of their family, Charles Clifton Carr, who died in the Second Battle of Ypres in the First World War. Now, Charles Clifton Carr was also a London Central High School student. He graduated there. And when he enlisted in the war, he was a private in the 3rd Battalion of the Canadian Infantry. What is notable about the 3rd Battalion is that it was in line in April of 1915 during what is known as the Second Battle of Ypres. Because what happened there was the first gas attack of the war took place. Picture in your mind a huge cloud coming across no man's land, and everybody is in their trenches and they're wondering what is happening. It hits the French lines. The French line folds, and then the Canadians are not as direct. But what happened is the Canadians were left on the field by themselves and became the point of the attack. Charles Clifton Carr, somewhere in that process, was wounded. And he had to have been in an area that was overrun by the Germans because he was taken prisoner. And he was taken to actually a hospital in Germany. And that is where he passed away from his wounds on May 2nd, 1915. And he is the only individual on this tour that we're aware of that actually died as a prisoner of war in Germany in the First World War. And he was 21 years old when he passed away. This is the memorial to John Alistair McGregor of the McGregor family, which was a farming family in Delaware, Ontario. He enlisted in the First World War. He was 18 years old, and that was in September of 1915 with the 3rd Battalion Canadian Infantry. Where the story of John McGregor and his death becomes interesting is given to the fact that he was killed in what was known as a trench raid. The Canadians were very good at this. It was used to take Canadians from the trenches on the Canadian side over across no man's land into the German side. So they would go to do that, and its purpose was to terrorize, take prisoners. And the size of the trench raids went anywhere from 8 men up to a battalion of 1,000 men. Well, McGregor was killed in a battalion-size trench raid. And the only reason why they know that he was killed is because he never came back. And so he was presumed dead. And that was on December 9th, 1916, and he was 19 years old. But when you talk about someone that dies in a trench raid, you should say something about the missing Canadian soldiers that died in France. And any soldier that has no known grave, his name is put on the Vimy Memorial at Vimy Ridge. There are 11,168 names of Canadian soldiers that are memorialized on the Vimy Ridge. And John Alistair McGregor was one of them. This is the Kent family monument here at Woodland Cemetery, and this inscription is in honor of their son, Victor John Kent, who died in the First World War. Now, Victor John Kent was a major in the 13th Brigade Canadian Field Artillery, and he was educated at the Royal Military College of Canada. He worked as a civil engineer before the war, and he enlisted in March of 1916. Eventually, he was posted with the 13th Brigade. As an officer, he was always known for his bravery and for placing the needs of his men above his own. The war diary of the 13th Brigade states that he died of wounds received during an enemy bombardment on March 14th, 1918. And his final words, quoted back to his family by his men, were as such: "Don't worry about me. I'll be all right. I'm just going down to see that the men are all under cover." As he proceeded down the trench to check on his men, that's when he was hit by shrapnel, artillery fire. And as a result, it was a mortal wound, and he bled out, and he died that very same day, March 14th. After, he was buried at Vimy Ridge Cemetery with full military honors. And back home, besides placing him on the stone here, his family memorialized him with a plaque at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, Ontario, and you can still see that plaque today. At the time of his death, Major John Victor Kent was only 33 years old. This is the last memorial on our World War I tour. And it is also one of the most interesting because this entire plaque is dedicated to Lieutenant Bartholomew Cottam, who was a Central London student. And he was one of 70 Central London students who died in the First World War. In 1915, he enlisted, and he joined the 91st Battalion. It was also known as the Elgins. When the regiment shipped over to England, he stayed with family friends, the Minute family, and he fell madly in love with their daughter, Winifred. So much so that they were betrothed to be married. And the banns were read in church, and then he would marry her on his first leave back from the front. So on December 1st, Cottam, before going home to get married, is asked to do one last patrol. And he's sent out to scout on what they call a snatch raid. And that means they went over to the enemy trenches, they captured a German soldier, they brought him back for information. So being a good officer, he went out ahead to scout the position in front of his men. And during that time that he was out, the enemy caught some kind of semblance of him being out there. And the first thing they do is they fire up flares. And the flares expose the person. Cottam was caught out in the open. They turned the machine guns on him. They turned the artillery on him. He didn't have a chance. He did not get back. But by going out alone, he saved his men's lives. The story of his death was placed here by his family. And there's a lot here to read, but if you ever come up to the cemetery, try to read it, because it's a very interesting story. So at the same time that Cottam dies over in the front, the Minute family is waiting for him to come back so that they could marry her daughter. But instead of him walking in the door to be with her and to marry her and have a life together, they received the news that Bartholomew Cottam is missing in action and that he is presumed dead. As his body was never found, his name is on the Vimy Memorial, and when he died, Bartholomew Cottam was only 20.